I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we report on revelations from a European leaders' conference call exposing the level of anxiety over the US peace proposals. We also cover the military drones spotted approaching President Zelensky's plane near Dublin, and we examine the new US national security strategy, which has alarmed many. Later, we return to our regular updates on the occupied territories and speak to a doctor about frontline medical provision for Ukrainian soldiers.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 5th of December. 3 years and 286 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by Associate Editor for Defence, Dom Nicholls, Executive Editor for Audio, Francis Dearnley, Dr. Jade McGlynn of King's College London, and Dr. James Gough of the David Nott Foundation, which trains doctors in Ukraine. But first, over to Dom for the latest news in the military realm.
Let's start in Russia. Last night, Ukrainian drones hit Russia's Temryuk seaport in Russia. That's just east of the Kerch bridge. They also hit the Syzran oil refinery in Samara Oblast. That's 1,000 kilometres east of Ukraine. That news comes from Russian officials and local media. So, well, I think we can probably rely on that then. Russia's Krasnodar Krai operational headquarters said fires have broken out on the site of the Temryuk seaport. And earlier local residents said that area was under attack with fuel tanks there burning. Meanwhile, 1,000 kilometres east, residents of the city of Syzran reported explosions at the local oil refinery last night. This comes from Astra media site on Telegram. Syzran Mayor Sergei Volodchenkov, he confirmed the drone attack against the city, but did not mention any targets by name. Luckily, though, local residents helped him out by posting videos and images of the attack on social media. In Ukraine, only 80 of 137 Russian drones were shot down last night. That's a much lower percentage than in memory, I think, at least a couple of years. Ukraine's General Staff, however, said that yesterday 1,250 Russian casualties were inflicted, so casualties being killed, wounded, missing or taken prisoner. I mention that because in the last few days, that daily number, they put the number out every day, but that daily tally has been creeping up, and that is much higher than in recent weeks. Plus, as I've said before, Western officials do take the statistics from Ukraine's General Staff as pretty much accurate. So 1,250 yesterday, that daily number higher than in recent weeks, mainly down to the fighting in Pokrovsk, which, again, we've got no new news for you. We still think that that city has been taken by Russia. Minarad to the east still doesn't seem to be completely under Russian control, but I think it is fair to say that it's lost to Russia. It's now a question of whether or not Ukraine can get the people out safely. Now, across the country this morning, Kharkiv, Donetsk and Zaporizhia were hit with glide bombs just in the last few hours. There are casualties, although I've not seen updated figures or any figures indeed about casualty numbers from the strikes in the last few hours. Now, the Kremlin's latest information campaign, destined to spread narratives of Russian invincibility and the inevitable victory, continues. 4 years into Putin's lightning 3-week offensive, Moscow apparently is poised, we are led to believe, we are told to believe, poised to strike in the north and the south of Ukraine. And it's only Russia's desperate desire to seek a peaceful resolution to the crisis that's holding them back. That's what we're expected to believe anyway. Now, despite being unable to mount significant simultaneous attacks for quite a number of years now, we're told that first, in the north, Putin's troops are about to launch an offensive into Chernihiv city, and second, down south, Odessa and Mykolaiv continue to exist only because of Moscow's benevolence. It's amazing, the resurgence in military capability that can be achieved when Steve Witkoff is out on his travels. Anyway, yesterday, Ukrainian Centre for Combating Disinformation head, Lieutenant Andrei Kovalenko, he warned that Russian sources are spreading narratives about Russian forces purportedly preparing for these offensive operations against Chernihiv and elsewhere. He said Russia does not have the manpower or materiel required for such an assault, and said all the chatter reminded him of the dire threats issued by Russia earlier this year against Kharkiv and Sumy cities, which are, last time I checked, still in Ukrainian hands. Now, Institute for the Study of War, the Washington-based think tank, says there's been a bit of an uptick in Russian mill blogger circles chatting about Chernihiv's impending doom, but even they are fairly lacklustre in their efforts. So I don't think they're putting much credibility on these reports from Russia. But in comments similarly worthy of ridicule, Russian State Duma Defense Committee Deputy Chairperson Alexei Zurevlev said on Wednesday of this week that Russian commanders have not been publicly reporting on activity in the Kherson direction recently because Russian forces are, quote, deliberately not intensifying offensive operations there. That's nice of them. He said Russian forces definitely could intensify in the area and then could launch an offensive on Odessa and Mykolaiv cities, such that Ukraine would have, quote, no other major cities left on the Black Sea coast. Zurevlev threatened that Russian forces could use occupied Crimea as a launch point for such offensive operations, both on land and at sea. I think he was then given a blanket and a biscuit and told to go back, carry on watching Stalingrad. Now then, last couple for me. 4 military drones breached a no-fly zone and flew toward Volodymyr Zelensky's jet before it landed in Dublin airport on Monday, it has emerged. The drones reached the location where President Zelensky's plane was expected to be, but the flight had landed slightly ahead of schedule at 11 p.m. local time. This comes from the Journal. Now, the unidentified drones then orbited above an Irish Navy vessel, I think one of the 8 that they have, that had apparently secretly been deployed into the Irish Sea ahead of Mr Zelensky's first visit to Ireland. Sources told the Journal that the drones took off northeast of Dublin before flying for 2 hours. It's not known who launched them or exactly where they came from. Security sources suspect the drones aimed to disrupt President Zelensky's arrival. They weren't trying to hide themselves. The drones had their lights on, we're told. So they were just trying to create a nuisance, although obviously it's extremely dangerous flying such things in the vicinity of jets. Security sources said the drones were military grade and that the incident could be classified as an act of hybrid warfare. The public was explicitly told that there was a no-drone zone above Dublin for President Zelensky's trip. And the Irish Times later reported 5 drones, and not the 4 that had earlier been reported, but 5 had breached the no-fly zone. This triggered a major security alert, but sources told the paper that President Zelensky's plane was slightly earlier and therefore not in danger. Now, sources told the Irish Times that Russian security services are most likely to be blamed, but there is no direct evidence for it. The drones, as I say, had their lights on and it appeared that they wanted to be seen, according to one security source. This individual said that they had the capability and intent. They could have taken action at any moment of their choosing. Now, Ireland's Department of Defence refused to comment, but citing operational security reasons. Barry Andrews, a Fianna Fáil Member of Parliament, said it's a criminal offence to operate a drone within this area without permission. He had prematurely, he thanked the Irish Aviation Authority and the police for keeping President and Mrs Zelensky safe. Bold call. Now, the drones then approached the Irish Navy ship, as we said, the William Butler Yeats, which was apparently secretly deployed off Dublin, but it doesn't have an air radar, so it couldn't see the drones coming. Lookouts on the deck, we are told, spotted the drones, probably because they were lit up against the night sky, and they decided not to shoot them down because they had no ability on board to disable them. The only air defence capability was the ship's machine guns. Now, of the Irish Air Corps' 24 aircraft that were patrolling nearby, some were patrolling nearby but didn't engage the drones. The Taoiseach and Ministers for Justice and Defence were briefed on the incident just after it happened, but we don't know if President Zelensky heard about it while he was in the country. Just while I'm on the subject and having upset Australia and New Zealand recently, talking about their defence spending, it's worth noting that in 2024, Ireland spent €1.3 billion, about the same in US dollars, €1.3 billion on defence, equating to 0.24% of GDP. But a record €1.5 billion has been allocated for 2026, although that still is only a quarter of 1% of GDP. Now then, last one for me. Reuters, in the last couple of hours, are saying that the United States wants Europe to take over the majority of NATO's conventional defence capabilities, ranging everything from intelligence to missiles, by 2027. I stress the word conventional there. Now, this comes from Pentagon officials apparently speaking to diplomats in Washington this week. Reuters say the message, which was recounted by 5 sources familiar with this discussion, including a US official, was said to have been conveyed at a meeting in Washington this week of Pentagon staff overseeing NATO policy and several European delegations. So that is pretty significant, although given all the signals that we've been getting from the United States, their disinterest in NATO, perhaps it comes as no surprise. But I would just say that contrasts slightly news that comes out of NATO today of the alliance rejigging the boundaries of its subordinate military commands. The alliance says today that it's going to transfer responsibility of the geographic areas of Denmark, Sweden and Finland from the headquarters Joint Force Command Brunssum, that's in the Netherlands, to Joint Force Command Norfolk in Virginia in the United States. So Sacker, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the big military bod, head of NATO, runs NATO, nice chap. Air Force General Alexis Grinkovich, he said, with the alignment of our adversaries around the globe, it is imperative we strengthen the Euro-Atlantic area as much as possible and reinforce our posture in the high north. This realignment, which integrates as a whole the Nordic nations, including NATO's 2 newest members, Sweden and Finland, under Joint Force Command Norfolk's leadership, does exactly that. Now, this is going to make JFC Norfolk's, Joint Force Command Norfolk's area of responsibility, Denmark, Finland, well, it will include Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden and the UK, in addition to the maritime area of the Atlantic. General Grinkovich said, in terms of NATO's joint force commands, Norfolk is the strategic bridge between North America and Europe, defending far more than just our sea lines of communication. So, when I first saw that, I thought it was slightly odd that I know in this day of cyber and everything, geography doesn't count for so much, but integrating those 2 new countries, but moving the headquarters away from the Netherlands to Virginia, even though JFC Norfolk is much bigger, that struck me as slightly odd. But put that to one side for a moment. I thought that news sat slightly at odds with the suggestion from Reuters that the US is looking to pull out of NATO's conventional defence framework. And they may well want Europe to step up and take on more responsibility, but that the 2 aren't necessarily happy bedfellows. Anyway, that's us up to date, Adélie.
Thank you, Dom. And now to Francis for the diplomatic update.
Well, thanks very much, Adélie. I'm not sure if any of you have ever dipped into the old White House tapes. There's one where JFK's on the phone to Eisenhower during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's another of LBJ conferring with Bobby Kennedy about unrest in the South. If you haven't, they're really worth a search on YouTube. They offer a window into how leaders were thinking in the heat of some of the century's most critical moments. Now, usually that, of course, is a luxury we have to wait years for, either in memoirs, diaries, or when the archives open. And I mention that just to underscore how rare the scoop is in Der Spiegel, published after our broadcast yesterday. They've obtained notes from the confidential conference call between President Zelensky and EU leaders, which took place on Monday. The one where President Macron of France, Chancellor Merz of Germany, Alexander Stubb of Finland, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen joined NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and others. A big meeting. Now, according to Der Spiegel, Merz and Macron used bold words indeed. Quote, there is a chance that the US will betray Ukraine on territory without clarity on security guarantees, said Macron. There is, he said, a big danger for Zelensky. Merz then said that Zelensky must be very careful in the coming days. They are playing games with both you and us, Merz apparently said, likely in reference to the 2 US negotiators Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. President Stubb apparently warned, we must not leave Ukraine and Volodymyr alone with these guys. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte concurred, I agree with Alexander that we need to protect Volodymyr. Now, that captures the rising unease in Europe as events seem to outpace them. Paris has denied Macron expressed himself in those words, but declined to provide information on how Macron did, if it wasn't in that fashion. Also discussed in the call were the frozen Russian state assets in Europe. The participants apparently repeatedly emphasised that it must be made clear to the US that the issue of frozen assets is exclusively reserved for the EU. But here too there's a problem, in that it only takes one power, like Belgium, and the whole attempt is arguably jeopardised. That's the danger of effective veto. In such large bodies, you are arguably only as strong as your weakest link. and one senses that the US is eager to keep the card of the frozen assets on the table in their negotiations with Moscow, regardless of the EU's views. And we just don't know what pressure is being put on certain European powers by Washington behind closed doors. Now, just on the subject of the economic measures, France 24 reports that 2 days after Witkoff and Kushner met Putin, the US Treasury partially suspended measures that Trump announced in October when he finally vowed to get tough on Moscow, specifically sanctions against Lukoil-branded gas stations outside of Russia. While a ban remains in place to prevent the money from flowing back to Russia, it shows a softening of their stance. Many are asking, what did the US get in return for that relaxation of measures? Certainly, it wasn't a dialing down of Kremlin rhetoric. In an interview on Indian TV yesterday during his trip to New Delhi, Putin, when asked about the conversations with Witkoff and Kushner, said, quote, "I doubt it would interest you to hear about it, as it lasted 5 hours. Frankly, even I grew weary of it. 5 hours is much too much." He also said yesterday, either we liberate these territories in the Donbass by force of arms, or Ukrainian troops leave these territories. Now, just to give you further evidence of the distrust felt in Europe towards the US negotiating team, Chancellor Merz said some people in the US want to gain some economic benefit from the possible settlement of the war, and is holding today an unscheduled meeting with the Belgian Prime Minister to discuss the possible use of those frozen assets for a reparation loan to Ukraine. Ursula von der Leyen will also be there. The other big document of the day is the publication of the White House's new national security strategy. Like President Stubbs' epic essay yesterday, it's too long for me to comprehensively summarise here, but we'll link to it in the episode description. Some key snippets, however, will make further troubling reading for the Ukrainians and the European allies. Just listen to some of these specific bullet points. Our broad policy for Europe should prioritise enabling Europe to stand on its own feet and operate as a group of aligned sovereign nations, including by taking primary responsibility for its own defence without being dominated by any adversarial power, cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations, then building up the healthy nations of Central, Eastern and Southern Europe through commercial ties, interesting words, weapons sales, political collaboration and cultural and educational exchanges. This is the big one, ending the perception and preventing the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. It goes on to say later on in the document that American diplomacy should continue to stand up for genuine democracy, again, interesting use of words, freedom of expression and unapologetic celebrations of European nations' individual character and history. America encourages its allies in Europe to promote this revival of spirit, and the growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed gives cause for great optimism. Our goal should be to help Europe correct its current trajectory. So, in essence, this is J.D. Vance's now famous critique of Europe in Munich back in February, but framed as now national policy. On Ukraine, in diplomatic speak, the document effectively argues Kyiv can't win, that Europe is the chief obstacle to peace, and is actually suppressing democracy in the name of keeping the war going. So just listen to this, which will be golden nectar in the ears of the Kremlin's propaganda department. The Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. A large European majority wants peace. Yet that desire is not translated into policy, in large measure because of those governments' subversion of democratic processes. This is strategically important to the US precisely because European states cannot reform themselves if they are trapped in political crisis. Now, as Shashank Joshi of The Economist argues, this strategy is a bad omen indeed for the direction of the administration on many, many different fronts. He says it represents a return to the US assault on Europe seen in February, reversing the modest gains that were made after the Hague summit and the subsequent Euro diplomacy in Washington. It will reinforce the view that not only is the US commitment to Europe waning, but the US sees nothing to deter or defend against in Europe other than the Europeans themselves, their ruling parties and their minorities. There's not a single word in the document that addresses Russia as a threat of any kind. It'll also strengthen the perception that Europe has to be ready to deter and defend against Russia with minimal or no assistance from the US. However, this doesn't change the fact that such readiness cannot realistically be achieved within the lifespan, Shashank says, of this US administration. Therefore, much of the timeline for European autonomy will depend on what happens in 2028. Now, just on that as a tangent, many European countries, I would argue, are calculating that this might be a temporary blip. That is extremely dangerous. I think, that we need to be seeing the United States, frankly, as being potentially led by J.D. Vance from 2028. He certainly is the most dominant figure in a lot of ways. And just lastly, Shashank again, the National Security Strategy section on China also have implications for Europe. The document discusses strategic competition and technological competition, but frames these largely in terms of trade balance. The US aims to work with partners to counteract Chinese predatory economic practices. Nevertheless, every other aspect of the document reinforces the perception that the US is becoming a decreasingly attractive and trusted partner, not for the Europeans. So an important document, one historians of the future will no doubt devour and debate. But that's where we are, Adélie, in the political realm today.
Thanks, Francis. And now, over to our regular segment with Dr. Jade McGlynn, dedicated to the occupied territories. Hi, Jade. So good to have you back. What are the updates from the occupied territories today?
Thank you. So today we're looking at between the 19th of November and the 4th of December 2025, and Ukrainian resistance forces conducted at least 17 operations by our confirmation, so mine and Ilya's. The heaviest tempo was around the Zaporizhzhia axis, where we've already seen the Russians towards the other side making advances towards Hulyai-Polye. And we also have seen quite a high tempo of resistance operations around Kherson's left bank. There were 2 targeted arsons in Crimea against vehicles used by Russian forces, and overall points towards a campaign focused on stressing supply and security or security of logistics across the southern front lines, and actions, as always, focused on deniability, but also a sense of repeatability, which is interesting. So I'm going to go through them regionally. In occupied Kherson, in the left bank, on the 21st of November, Srok reported a strike on a Russian position that used mines and assault tactics, and it was against Russian troops in place there. 2 days later, on the 23rd of November, again, sort of in the occupied part of Kherson, we saw the destruction of an OSA air defense system, which was, of course, to disable local air cover. In occupied Zaporizhzhia region, on the 27th of November, Srok hit a military evacuation vehicle that was transporting wounded Russian soldiers. Obviously, the soldiers died as a result of the hit. On the 30th of November, near Berdyansk, HUR, so Ukrainian military intelligence, reported 2 explosions against Akhmat units. So these are the Chechen Kadyrov-C pro-Kadyrov units, and damaged 2 vehicles and inflicted again several casualties. And this is an example that we see quite a lot of, particularly with HUR, of Ukrainian forces working closely with local partisan networks on the ground. On the 1st of December, along the road that leads into Berdyansk, there was a roadside blast that killed 5 Rosgvardia soldiers and wounded 4 others. 1 Tiger armoured vehicle carrier and 2 pickups were damaged. So again, we see this targeting of security forces, particularly on the kind of key logistics roads. In Crimea, in occupied Crimea, on the 29th of November, Anti-Smersh claimed the destruction of a logistics vehicle in Pervomayske, so it's supplying Russian troops. This is one of the more typical sort of anti-transport arson that I think listeners are quite used to by this point. And on the 3rd of December in Krasnohordiske, again, Anti-Smersh showed images of a Russian officer's car that had been burned, another arson attack. So those are the broad events that have been happening. As a note to non-violent resistance, on the 21st of November, we saw in Mariupol some leafleting and some printed pictures of Ukrainian flags put up around Mariupol to mark the 21st of November, so the National Day of Dignity and Freedom. It's quite rare now to see these sort of graffiti and leafleting campaigns, just because that's a considerable amount of risk and you need to think about the risk in a strategic way. However, several movements, including Mariupol Resistance, do use it for special important days, such as the Day of Dignity and Freedom that marks both the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity. And these sort of more semi-public, though they're done in very covert ways, of course. They're rarer, but they're much more targeted around special days, such as we've seen here in Mariupol.
Thanks, Jade. And do you get a sense that all the diplomatic movements of the last couple of weeks, the peace plan, the conversations between Trump, Russia, Zelensky, the Europeans fighting for a space at the table, do you see that impacting the resistance or life in the occupied territories? Do you have any inkling of that?
Not really. I mean, of course, I think trust and faith in America as an ally among Ukrainians in the occupied territories had long since dissipated. So I don't think it had a huge effect. Of course, there's a shock factor. You know, it's one thing to feel let down by somebody, and it's quite another to feel utterly betrayed and flabbergasted. But in general, as in most of Ukraine, I think most people have understood the 28-point plan as just a Russian information operation, because Russians not interested in a ceasefire or ending it. So I think if there was anything, there was perhaps a frustration that Western media, or even Western politicians, much more worryingly, because, you know, the media has to cover the news, but politicians should be able to react more strategically, were again falling for what in most Ukrainians' view, and bluntly in my view, was just a Russian psyop against us all, and we all, particularly the Americans, just look like total fools.
Okay, thank you so much, Jade. Any other updates, any other thing we should be thinking about or knowing about the occupied territories in the last couple of weeks?
I think one of the key elements is the new national policy decree, the strategy for a national policy decree that was signed last week, which sets some really specific metrics, such as, 2.65 million Ukrainians have to have taken part in patriotic events by the year 2036, talking about residents of the occupied territories, that 95% of people need to say that they have a Russian civic identity. It's a very interesting document in lots of ways. I mean, a lot of it isn't wildly different from much of the very ideological and kind of civilizationist strategies and policies and foundations and doctrines that come out at certain points from the Kremlin. But this one was different just because it had these very concrete metrics. And, there was considerable time dedicated to the occupied territories, or the so-called new regions, as they're called in Russian. Again, another horrific euphemism. And there was also, in some ways, what's interesting is what's implicit, in the sense that there's a reason that special attention is paid towards the occupied territories. And it's quite clear from the way they're written about that there's this continued fear and trepidation around an enduring sense of Ukrainianness in these territories, and enduring Ukrainian identity, which, of course, on the Russian side is dismissed as terrorism and extremism, an extremist belief or view.
Thank you, Jade.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Adélie.
Turning to our live guest now, welcoming the podcast listener James Gough, Chief Executive of the David Nott Foundation, which trains doctors in Ukraine and other war zones. We've done several segments dedicated to the subject of medical issues on the frontline recently, and we thought it would be helpful to hear how things can be improved and what we can learn from the Ukrainian medics themselves. Francis, you're steering this segment.
Yes, James, it's great to have you on. Could you first perhaps just summarise for us the role of the David Nott Foundation? Over to you, James.
Thanks, Francis. Great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting myself and the David Nott Foundation. So the clue is in the name. David Nott is probably the foremost war surgeon, certainly of our lifetime. And the foundation was set up to train doctors to be war doctors, to give them the skills they need to be able to operate on patients in times of need, and really that's operating on them from head to toe. So traditionally, you might expect a surgeon to be able to operate in their area of specialty, but what our courses do, and we go to the front lines to do these courses, is take them through the 40 to 50 operations that you may need to do if you're the only surgeon on the front line. And we've been doing that all over the world, and obviously since the full-scale invasion in Ukraine.
Thank you, James. Really interesting. Can you just talk to us in a little bit more detail about the state of play with regard to Ukraine's medical system at the moment?
So, yeah, sure. I'm not in Ukraine at the moment, but I was there a couple of weeks ago, and I was able to both visit one of our courses, which was training 30 surgeons in Kyiv. Surgeons from all over the country, though, do travel from the front line to our courses. And I was also able to visit a couple of the hospitals. I guess you could say that the Ukrainian medical system is the reverse of the UK system. They've got a very, what I would say, a poor medical specialist training system, which is based on a Soviet model, which is more of an apprenticeship style, where you as a junior doctor, you qualify and then you ally yourself to a single person usually, and you spend 3 years with them. So, of course, their mistakes become your mistakes. Whereas in the UK, we have very well structured 6 to 7 year specialist training pathways. However, in the UK, we're vastly underprepared for conflict and to carry out hostile environment surgery, whereas in Ukraine, they've got these unique skill sets. A junior would probably struggle to take out a gallbladder, but is quite accomplished now at doing damage control surgery on the front line to save a life when needed. So it's a kind of a reverse of our own system. But the problem is they've got very junior doctors, and so they don't have the technical skills necessary. A lot of them are being sent to the front line. And my Ukrainian colleague I was speaking to yesterday, she said the other major problem is that many of these junior doctors are leaving the country.
That's very concerning to hear. And we've done reporting on the podcast recently of certain medical issues relating to blood supplies being very low. I wonder if you could comment on that briefly, James.
Well, only in as much as I could talk about some of the techniques that they're learning, which we traditionally, I was a former military doctor myself, would have called buddy-to-buddy transfusion. So when you are far at reach and perhaps blood is not available, or at least your evacuation routes are stymied, which is the case in Ukraine, you're relying on your colleagues around you to be able to take their blood and put it straight into the patient that you have. So that was, certainly in my time in the military, that was a fairly extreme practice, and that would really be reserved for perhaps special forces or places where you really didn't have an evacuation option. But it's now something that is mainstreamed in Ukrainian medical practice.
Thank you. Now, if we're talking then about what can be done to improve things, I know this is something that you're focused on in your work at the foundation, but more broadly, I know there are many others who will also be involved in this. What needs to be done and what can be done? And I know there'll be many people listening who might even be in a position to help, including charities and other organisations, in terms of making the frontline experience medically less in this precarious way that you describe.
Yeah, so obviously we're doing what we're doing, and we're doing it as fast as we can, and we're delivering as many courses as we can. And we work very closely with the Ministry of Health to make sure that we're training the right people that are going to be working in those centres, whether it's the frontline centres or what's called Role 4, fairly far back from the front line. So I certainly don't think we've got a monopoly on that market, and there is definitely a vast need for more training and emergency training. However, I do think that much like the rest of the UK and other allied nations have been using their institutional infrastructure to be able to support new institutions in Ukraine and to rebuild institutions, I do think that the onus is on some of our royal colleges and some of the other medical colleges around Europe and the US to help Ukraine create a much more robust medical training pathway so that the doctors that are being trained really, really well. Yuliana, one of our Ukrainian faculty, she's an anaesthetist, a phenomenal doctor, but she has pretty much learnt all of her skills in crisis. And so the first ever subclavian vein, which is sticking a line into one of the major veins of the body, was on the front line, and she was the only option, and the patient would have died had she not essentially given it a go. And that really shouldn't be the case. So I do think some of our medical institutions in the UK could be doing more.
Thank you. And then as the other subject I really wanted us to explore together, James, it's what Ukraine can teach us. We are seeing here in real time a different kind of war being fought, different kinds of injuries, and on a scale that hasn't been seen arguably on European soil since the Second World War. What can Ukraine and what is Ukraine teaching medical professionals today?
Well, actually, I'm glad we're having this today, because yesterday we've had a very cool week up in Scotland at our cadaveric hostile environment surgical training course, because we had a couple of Ukrainian surgeons from the Frontline come to give us a talk on some of their new practice. And quite remarkably, fairly close to the front line, they're now doing laparoscopic, so keyhole surgery, even in the chest, so on shrapnel and bullet wounds to the heart and to the lungs, which is quite amazing to see, using very sophisticated equipment to gain minimal access, which means that the patients recover. And you wouldn't expect that if you'd got a bullet wound to the chest or shrapnel to the chest, that you would be back on the front line fighting within fairly short order. But the reason they're doing it is because with minimally invasive surgery, you recover faster. And for the Ukrainians, that's national security. That means that they can return these fighters to the front line despite having been shot once. So there's some really interesting stuff that they were showing us this week in Edinburgh, and really challenging medical dogma and what we think we know at the moment. And what was also very interesting was that the audience this week have been doctors from Finland, from Burma, from Taiwan. So this knowledge exchange and what the Ukrainians are learning the hard way is actually going to be translated. And that's one of our big focus areas at the David Nott Foundation, translating that knowledge to every conflict zone globally so that people don't have to relearn this stuff. And then the next thing is around this idea of the traditional role 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is the evacuation chain that is sort of military medical doctrine, and to challenge that, particularly from role 1, which is close to where the injury happens, back to role 2, which is where you might expect you could get some surgery. But they are obviously innovating the hard way with new evacuation methods, and again, just trying to translate some of the things that are working and some of the things that are not working into essentially new medical doctrine on the battlefield.
Hi James, it's Dom here. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks so much for listening. I do appreciate your support. Just a question, I'm ex-army as you probably know, just wondered what your views are on where we are in terms of provision of medical care, civilian and military, after the experiences, particularly for Western countries, NATO, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Have we moved on from there, used that as a springboard to carry on, or has the sort of momentum slowed down a bit? Have we used the lessons from those conflicts to really push on and incorporate it into civilian life? Where are we in that regard?
I've probably got a glass half full, a glass half empty on that. Obviously, our civilian trauma systems have been completely transformed because of Afghanistan, because of Iraq, and for the better. And our survival rates in civilian trauma centres around the UK are vastly improved. But what I would say is we are vastly underprepared for a conflict such that you can see in Ukraine. And I get requests from countries all over Europe looking to upskill their civilian health infrastructure and to start implementing some of our hostile environment surgical training courses, of which we do surgery, anaesthetics and obstetrics, because they see that national security is health security. So I would say in terms of our civilian infrastructure, and I can't really comment on the military, but I would suspect that they're not getting the experience they really, really need to be able to be a surgeon or an anaesthetist or an obstetrician able to cope with any eventuality because of this subspecialization and super subspecialization that our system has cultivated. All for the right reasons, but it makes us very vulnerable when it comes to potential conflict.
James, thanks so much for your time today. We'll, of course, in the show notes, link to the foundation for those who want to learn more, and we'll come back to you for your final thoughts in a few moments' time. But really appreciate it. And I think, what you're saying speaks to the fact that while some countries are thinking ahead and learning the lessons, there's still a woeful underpreparedness on so many different fronts in Europe if things do turn sour. But very much appreciate your time today.
Thanks very much. Just while I'm thinking about it, there was recently a podcast episode from our sister podcast, Battle Lines, about the rise of amputations in Ukraine, facing a literal amputation crisis because of the misuse or because of tourniquets, but also because of the lack of resources on the front line. So we will link to that in the show notes. It was a fascinating episode. Let's go to our final thoughts then. Dom, do you want to start?
Thank you. I would like to say thank you to Ambassador Teemu Turunen and the staff of the Finnish embassy here in London. It was Finland's Independence Day yesterday. I was invited to a diplomatic shindig last night at the ambassador's residence. I got I didn't get into trouble, but I said the reindeer canapé was a bit chewy, which it was nice. It tasted a bit like sort of beef jerky, but chewy was taken as an inappropriate.
How many countries have we offended this week?
Well, the week's not over yet.
The Italians this week.
So the reindeer canapé.
Have opinions about food that will make me laugh forever.
Well, I did have another opinion. Apparently, Finland takes Christmas porridge exceptionally seriously. Risipuro, I think. Please tell me if that's wrong. Risipuro. Porridge, and I was speaking to the defence attaché's wife. She was telling me at great length how long it takes to create this thing. You soak the oats for 20 odd minutes, and then you boil them for another 20 minutes, and then you stir the porridge for an hour. I mean, it was a very long affair for creating a bowl of porridge, at which point I said, why don't you just bung it in the microwave? And the look she gave me, I thought I was about to be chucked out of the residence, and they were about to get out of NATO, quite frankly. Anyway, it was a lovely evening. I spoke to a number of officials, and on background, as in not saying where it came from, but I was struck by two things. Firstly, one individual told me that a couple of weeks ago something changed in Germany and Europe more broadly, such that Germany has decided we really do need to take this issue by the scruff of the neck. Europe needs to step up, and Germany is prepared to do it. Chancellor Friedrich Merz is prepared to be in the vanguard of European effort here now if the US is stepping back from its support for Ukraine. So I thought that was very interesting. I couldn't draw the individual on, and I don't think the individual knew what had happened, if it was just a decision. But now when I see these comments coming out of these sort of leaked phone calls and what have you, it does suggest perhaps that Europe's finally decided, right, we need to sort of set our own course here. And the other thing I heard from another individual was that this whole NATO 5% pledge is going to come back and possibly bite NATO in the bum next year in Turkey in July at the next NATO conference. The whole 5% thing was sold to Donald Trump as this is, NATO taking things seriously, etc., etc. The individual told me that Donald Trump doesn't actually know that it's split 3.5% on hard defence, 1.5% on associated defence expenditure, blah, 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 blah. Right old, as we said, a total gift to those that want to fudge their defence spending. And so that's going to come as a bit of a shock when Donald Trump realises that it's not everyone stepping up 5% on heavy metal. And also, I was told that the further north and the further east you go in Europe, the greater was the desire for it to be a hard 5% on heavy metal as soon as possible, i.e. pledged this year for expenditure over the next plans in place for the next 2 or 3 years, as opposed to what it's resulted in, which is the 5% split, 3.5%, 1.5% by 2035. And I was told that it was the United Kingdom that really pushed for that, or put the brakes on and push it to as far to the right as possible, and the split, which was not particularly impressive. So those were the two bits of, those are the only two bits of really sort of impressive news. The rest of it was just sort of vaguely stumbling around, upsetting people in the diplomatic circuit. Although I was delighted to hear the Finnish residence is next door to the Russian ambassador's residence. And I said, have you got any contact at all, any diplomatic contact? Do you help each other put the bins out on a Sunday night, anything like that? And apparently, no, not at all. And I was told by one of the embassy staff, Russia has a tennis court in the garden, which obviously abuts the Finnish garden. And occasionally tennis balls are come over the fence. And I said, is this the only diplomatic channel you help out? And I was told, no, we don't even throw the tennis balls back.
Right, and you're taking your break from diplomacy, or we're holding your breath and you're going to make another faux pas before the end of the week?
Well, I'm delighted to say I'm going to the US Embassy in a couple of hours. I've been invited to go to for the World Cup draw. So given all the things that are going on with the US administration decisions over NATO and Ukraine, renaming the Institute for Peace the Donald J. Trump, or whatever it was, Trump, sorry, not Chump. God, I started already. No, I can't. I can confidently predict no diplomatic faux pas from Don Balls for the rest of the day.
No criticising the hot dogs then?
Well, an abomination of a... I wouldn't... Yeah, maybe.
All right, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Adélie. All that talk of porridge has reminded me of when I upset our Swedish listeners by lambasting their porridge-related breakfasts, and that very generous listener sent in a recipe book of Swedish porridge, which I will try and make over the Christmas period. But thanks very much for that. It sits proudly on my desk. But just speaking of Christmas, this weekend, the Telegraph's annual Christmas fundraiser formally begins. We're raising money for 4 charities this year: the Motor Neurone Disease Association, Prostate Cancer Research, Canine Partners and the Not Forgotten. We're doing also our phone-in. I'll be there on Sunday, and if you're in the UK and also around the world, although obviously you'll need to factor in putting in the country code before the number, which will appear on the website, there'll be lots of people there taking your donations, and it offers a chance to speak to us in person as we do so. I've chatted to many listeners over the years, including one who remembers Spitfires flying over their house during the Second World War as a child, which was quite a remarkable conversation. But as I say, looking forward to speaking to some of you on the phone-in. We'll add a link in the show notes to those of you who wish to donate or learn more about that. But thank you all very much, as ever, for your generosity this year, not only for the Telegraph's appeal there, but also, of course, for those appeals in David's memory earlier in the year. And you'll hear more about that and the consequences of your generosity in a future episode.
Just a note on the phone-in that you can't be guaranteed speaking to Francis, and you also can't request him on the phone.
You'll be pleased to hear.
So if you get him, that's a stroke of luck. My final thought, or not luck actually, I mean, depends however you see it. My final thought, I just wanted to flag 2 news stories of the last 24 hours about France, which I thought were quite interesting. One was an exclusive from Reuters, where a Russian woman, a Franco-Russian woman, was arrested in France, accused of spying and of having ties to Kremlin proxies in the context of the hybrid war. We had a lot of news about spies in the UK yesterday, so I think that's really important to keep the bigger picture of what's happening all across Europe on that front. And obviously we've mentioned several times on the podcast how much France is a target of the disinformation, of the hybrid warfare. So I think that's very important to keep in mind as well. And the second one is just from this morning, where several drones were spotted flying over a submarine base off the coast of Brittany in France, which is where all the nuclear-powered submarines are being kept, which is part of the French nuclear deterrence forces. I am translating live. There were 5 drones that were detected, and they were shot at by the naval forces who were at the base. So I think it's really interesting, especially with the news coming from Dublin this morning. And I think there's also a real ramp up in terms of drone incursions that are going more and more west every single time. I mean, if you remember just a few weeks ago, we were talking about Poland, we were talking about Estonia, then it was Germany, then it was Belgium, and now we're reaching Dublin and the west coast of France. Finistère is very, very much the western tip of France. It literally means the end of Earth, Finistère.
Really?
Yeah, it does.
Blimey.
The end of the earth is in France. That feels appropriate somehow.
Laughs, aren't they?
You can learn some things. So I think it's really interesting, especially in the context of the conversations we're reporting on at Chatham House, for example, last week, where that Italian MP was saying it's really hard to drive home the existential threat to his constituency in southern Italy. And I think in France and to some extent in the UK, that's also fairly similar. Russia feels very, very far away. Well, less and less so, as we can see. And let's go to James for the final thoughts. James, what do you want to leave us with?
Perhaps New Year's resolution, mobilize your institutions in whatever country you are in, your medical institutions in this case, to support Ukraine, because it will bear dividend for you and your own nations in preparing for any conflicts that might be coming down that way. So my advice would be to help Ukraine and you help yourselves.
A very strong place to leave it. Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in today. And we'll be back on Monday, same place, same time.
If I'm not locked up.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.